Greetings and welcome back to our study in Mark's Gospel. Today we are in chapter 15 of Mark. It's hard to believe I'm already almost done with Mark's Gospel. And in this video, we are going to discuss the first 20 verses of chapter 15. This is Jesus before Pilate and also Jesus being beaten by the soldiers under Pilate's guard. Before he is taken to be crucified. We're going to cut off right as he's taken to be crucified. But what we have here is the chief priests coming first thing in the morning to Pilate's house to say to him, we have this political prisoner. We have arrested him. He has admitted to being or to believing that he is the king of the Jews, even though that is not true. And we would like you to execute him in accordance with Roman law. Now again, we need to notice this is not a kangaroo court the way that some people would like to portray it. There is a common misconception that Jesus is innocent of everything, in that it was just trumped up charges that got him that made him seem guilty. The reality is Jesus has admitted to the Sanhedrin in the previous chapter that he is the Messiah. The Messiah in Jewish tradition is the king. He is not simply a religious figure, he's a political figure who is going to lead the people of Israel into freedom. He is a king. Different individuals in Jewish history claim to be the Messiah, the anointed one of God, and came with armies to lead people to freedom. There have been numerous outbreaks before Jesus, and there were some after Jesus to show that, to try to reclaim the freedom of Israel. So when the Sanhedrin comes to Pilate, they are not inherently trumping up charges. They are saying, we questioned this man. We found him to be guilty of your law because he has made this claim about himself. He said, when we asked him, are you the Messiah? Are you the anointed one? Are you the king? All three of those are different ways of saying the same thing. He said, I am. That's the claim before Pilate. When Pilate asked Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? There are two ways to read this. If you read it the way that the NIV does, you'll see that if you read their translation, they say that Jesus says yes, or some affirmation at least of the statement Pilate makes. Kind of, yes, you've said so. That's a very legitimate translation of what Jesus is saying. I don't think it's the best, but we'll get to that. If you accept that translation that the NIV uses, then it's even more confirmation that Jesus has admitted his guilt before Pilate, because Roman law said only Caesar had the power to anoint kings. And really, Caesar was the emperor. He was the king of kings. He had the only authority to call others king. So King Herod, who we know from Matthew chapters 1 and 2, King Herod was proclaimed king by the Roman Empire. He was allowed to use the title King of the Jews. At his death, the Romans took away that title. They took it away from Herod's sons, Agrippa and Philip, and all the others. They took that title back, and they gave different titles: governor, procurator, other titles for the local authorities in both Galilee and Judea, which are the two Roman provinces that the Bible really deals with. So when Jesus says, if Jesus says to Pilate, yes, you have said rightly, or something like that, then he is admitting guilt to Pilate according to Roman law. So this is not a fake trial. This is not some sort of kangaroo court. This is the the conflict between Jesus and society, the societies that we create. What we are seeing here is not simply trumped up charges against Jesus, some crooked court. This is legitimate court. This is legitimate law. What we see is the law is unjust. And so Jesus, we're confronted with, do we side with the unjust law or do we side with Jesus? We have to, what we're supposed to look at is, and ask ourselves in part is the law just? Is it fair? Is it good? Is it honest? And in the case here of the Roman law that says nobody's allowed to call themselves king, well, no, at least not according to Jesus and Jesus's way. So Jesus, though, is legitimately convicted. He is sentenced. I should say, I started out to say that there's another way to translate Jesus's response, which I think is much more accurate. But I do like the fact that the NIV just has him admitting his guilt. Jesus, it probably is more likely that Jesus is responding something like, "That's what you say." Jesus is probably saying that's what the charge is, and only answering to the bare minimum without actually admitting guilt or innocence, because what he wants is for the Romans and the temple authorities to prove that they are just trying to unjustly persecute him without considering the justice of the law, without considering what motivates them, without them questioning their pursuit of power and how that's corrupting them. Jesus is trying to stay out of this a little bit. And we see that the reason that that's probably the better translation is because the chief priests, the Sanhedrin, they keep going in their attack of Jesus, and Pilate kind of goes, "What, you're not going to stand up for yourself? You're not going to say anything?" And this is this back and forth of Jesus saying, "No, I'm not going to try to prove myself to you. I'm not going to try to prove myself to them. You are all corrupted by this search for power, this attempt to keep power in yourself, and I'm staying out of it." But this leads to the conflict between the Pharisees and Pilate. Now, we do not know that whether or not Pilate had this tradition that Mark ascribes to him. We don't have enough information. We don't have enough evidence to show that Pilate did this multiple times. That doesn't mean it's not accurate. It just means we don't have any corroborating evidence to support what Mark is saying, that this was Pilate's custom to release a prisoner. It might have been a one-off thing, and or a special circumstance kind of thing where Pilate was trying use this leverage to see where he stood. It is very possible that Pilate would do this, that he would release kind of a small-time criminal, political prisoner, as a sign of good faith towards the crowd in order to win them onto his side a little bit more. It's also possible that he never really did this. It's possible that this was a one-off event where Pilate was kind of judging whether or not the crowds where they would side and how they would react to the charges against Jesus. We aren't told. We don't have enough information. But what this is doing in the story is it is making everyone culpable for Jesus' death. What Mark and the other gospel writers want us to see is not that a certain group of people put Jesus to death, but that everyone is culpable. All humanity is culpable. And they do that by engaging the crowds, by saying, having Pilate say, hey, do you want Jesus or do you want Barabbas? Now, we sometimes, and this has been a fault within Christians since the earliest days, there is a temptation to fault, to lay blame on the Sanhedrin, or where the blame lies on the Sanhedrin, to expand that to the whole Jewish community in an anti-Semitic way. And that is not good. That is the exact opposite of what the Gospels are trying to tell us. Remember, the people who wrote the Gospels, the men who wrote the Gospels, are Jewish Christians. They are Jews. They understand the Jewish world. When they are talking about Jews, they are talking about their own people and themselves. This is a way for them to say that the entirety of humanity, even God's chosen people, are culpable for Jesus' death. It's easy for them, who are Jews, to understand that the Romans killed Jesus. That's easy. That's what they would expect. What the gospel writers are trying to do is turn that back on their own audience to say, well, you know what? You participated too. You have a part in this. So, to do that, in part, they introduce this. And again, that doesn't mean it's all made up. It just means that this is part of the reason why they include this story. They include this story about Pilate trying to release Jesus and the Pharisees asking for Barabbas. The irony in it is Barabbas is son of the Father. And that, of course, is what Jesus has been identifying himself as, son of the Father. Jesus has called himself God's son and has been called God's son a few times in the Gospels. And here we have Son of the Father standing in for Son of the Father. And it's just a clever play on words. In fact, in some manuscripts of Matthew, they even go so far as to give Barabbas a first name, and it is Jesus. And so it would really play that up. Jesus Barabbas, do you want Jesus Barabbas or Jesus of Nazareth, who is Barabbas? Which is kind of how that would work. The Pharisee or the Sanhedrin in this story, we are told that they kind of get behind the idea of we want Barabbas, and they kind of spur the crowd on to this, and we're kind of told that Pilate sees their jealousy of Jesus and understands Jesus' innocence. Now again, there is a sense in which that is true. Pilate would have seen very clearly what was going on. He would understand that these chief priests, the Sanhedrin, they were very much opposed to Jesus, in part because of his popularity. Pilate's no slouch here. He understands politics. He understands Jesus is popular. He understands that it's cutting into the influence of the chief priests. And if he has any idea of what Jesus has done earlier in that week, he's very much going to understand what's going on with the chief priests. And he is going to understand that they are jealous of Jesus. And he is going to understand that the chief priests are playing up the charges against Jesus. He's going to understand all of that. But there's also a sense in which Pilate is very much a politician. His role is to keep the peace, but more importantly than keeping the peace, his role is to maintain Rome's authority. He is to keep Rome in charge. So, he is not innocent here. He is not looking at Jesus going, well, Jesus is innocent, but there's nothing I can do. That's just not true at all. He's not looking at Jesus as this innocent man who the chief priests are turning over with absolutely no reason, and Pilate's just kind of meek and going along with it. That's not Pilate. He would not have gotten to be governor of Judea if that was his character. Instead, when we see him kind of say, what has Jesus done? Is he innocent? All these things. It's more of, well, they're playing up the charges. But what Pilate is probably doing here is playing a political game. He's dangling Jesus as a pawn in front of the Sanhedrin and in front of the crowds. He is very willing to kill Jews. He is very willing to crucify them. He needs no motivation whatsoever to do this. That's one of the few things we can say about Pilate from history, is he was very cold and calculated and knew what he was doing and was very quick to kill people. So what he seems to be doing here is playing the game, where he's saying to the Pharisees, oh, you want me to do you a favor. You want me to scratch your back. Well, this is going to cost you. He's using Jesus to gain political leverage because the Sanhedrin wants Jesus killed. So Pilate's kind of saying, well, yeah, I guess I can kill him for you. But what am I going to get? What kind of loyalty am I going to get in exchange? Again, the gospel writers are going to emphasize the Jewish responsibility because that's their people. That's the emphasis on God's people turning Jesus over. That's the emphasis on everybody. But there's a historical reality that Pilate's going along with this out of his own will too. He wants to do that, or at least he doesn't mind doing this. So he's perfectly glad to get a revolutionary out of the way, even if this person's maybe less of a threat than most other revolutionaries. He's going to do it. So he hands Jesus over to his guards, and they take him down to the courtyard, and they beat him, and they flog him, and they mock him with dressing him up as a king. This is just to show how brutal the Roman army was, and this is pretty standard for the Roman army. They were very brutal individuals. They mocked their enemies the same way that armies throughout history have mocked their enemies. Within the last couple of decades, the United States military went through a real scandal because of mocking their enemies in a similar way. The beatings, all of that would have been just common. I mean, this is not something that's out of the ordinary. The death of a crucifixion is not about killing somebody. If you're crucified, it is not, Rome is not trying to kill you. Rome is trying to make an example of you. They are trying to torture you and snuff your life out in the most humiliating and excruciating way possible. So what the soldiers are doing is consistent with crucifixion. They are mocking Jesus. They are humiliating him. They are beating him with as much as they can in a way that will show the Jewish citizens around them that the Romans are in control. This is another way of humiliating. It's also, if you read closely, the way that Mark tells this story, he does it with echoes of Isaiah, the suffering servant passages in Isaiah. So if you read Isaiah 50 and Isaiah 53, read them in their entirety and then come back and read Mark 15 starting in verse 16, and you are going to see echoes the way that Mark writes this. He wants you to connect Jesus's life with those passages because he wants you to see that Jesus, when he had the opportunity to fight back, did not. Instead, the bruised reed that he wouldn't break were these guards that were beating him. And that is an amazing testament to what Jesus was about. The suffering servant, the person who puts himself on the line for others, is the one who's being beaten and tortured. And there's a lot of allusions there that we should think about. It's not simply what Jesus endured, as great as that is. It is also about the example that Jesus sets for us. Anyway, that's where we are going to pick it up or stop. We are going to pick up right around verse 20 again with Jesus being led away to be crucified. So as always, if there's questions or comments, let me know. Also, I'd love to hear what you are thinking about when you read these passages. And until we meet again, God bless.